Hello to those of you who have joined us so far. If you could just, if I could have someone just type in the chat box and say they can hear me okay, then we're good to go. Can you hear me? If I could get someone just to type in the chat box and say, yes, I can hear you, that'd be great. Anybody? Can you hear me? Yay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, so all right then, we are good to go, and we will get started at the stroke of 10. All right, people are continuing to join at the moment, and again, we'll get started right at 10. Welcome to those of you who are joining us right now. Great to see you. Hello, and welcome to our webinar on heroic leadership and emotional intelligence. My name is David Corey, and I am with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company, and we are proud to be celebrating 20 years of service in 2018. And we are going to talk about heroic leadership and emotional intelligence. And we're going to jump right into taking a look at our agenda for our time together. So the issue is heroic leadership. Why is this an issue? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. This notion that that we've got a let's see, we've got someone who we've got a raised hand, so I'm just going to see what that's about. Okay. Yeah, if you have if there's any issue with the webinar, please type it into the chat box. I probably won't take a look at the question at the Q&A box until later on when we have our Q&A session. But any issues during the webinar, just let me know through the chat box, and I'll see that right away. Okay, so once again, at issue is the notion of heroic leadership, and we'll explore that, where it came from, why we believe that, why we want to believe it, that heroic leadership is the way to go. And then we'll talk about Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey. It's actually not the name of his book. The name of his book is something else. We'll talk about that as well. But he did talk about and outline what he calls the hero's journey. And so it's a very interesting look at some of what has influenced our opinion and also informed our notion of what a hero should be, what a leader should be, and we continue to have some of those ideas still today. Let's look at the relationship with EQ. EQ, as you know, is a measure of emotional intelligence, and we'll take a look at emotional intelligence and what the relationship might be. Some of our EQ competencies actually are potential strengths for heroic leaders, and others are potential deficits, and we'll look at what that means for leaders. Then we'll have a summary, and then we'll have a question and answer time at the end. So welcome, and let's jump right in. What is the definition of a hero? Well, the dictionary definition of a hero is a person who is admired or idealized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. For example, a war hero. Synonyms might include a brave person, a lionheart, a warrior, knight, champion, victor, conqueror. So these are all definitions of a hero. Oh, by the way, there is one subsequent definition, or additional definition rather, and that is in North America, it's another term for a submarine sandwich. Just thought we should throw that in just so you know we've covered all the bases. And again, we're not going to cover all the bases. I am not a Joseph Campbell scholar. I am not an expert on heroism or the idea of a hero, but it's just an interesting consideration that I've noticed in my work with managers on developing their emotional intelligence skills, and I thought I would share that with you today. Okay, so let's continue on and take a look at this man, Joseph Campbell. He's a very interesting author. He was focused on mythology, and he was a writer and a lecturer, and he was very well known for his work in comparative mythology and comparative religion. And he introduced the idea of the monomyth, one great big myth, referring to the theory that sees all mythic narratives, regardless of their origin or time, as variations of a single great story. And this has to do with what I often talk about after all my travels and working in many different countries and many different cultures around the world with emotional intelligence, which is all about how we know and understand ourselves and know and understand others, and for greater connection, communication, etc. We're far more similar than we are different, and it is quite fascinating that parts of our species who have never had any contact with the other have the same kinds of hopes, dreams, wishes, desires, and of course it follows that they would fashion similar mythology. And then there various archetypes emerge from this mythology. And Joseph Campbell described that as the hero's journey. And he described the hero's journey in the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, 1949. And what's happened as a result of Joseph Campbell's description of the hero's journey is that this journey has been taken up as the plot line for many, many movies, many books, TV series, dramas, etc. There is this notion of the journey that someone goes on, and we'll take a look at what we mean by that. So if you type in Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey into Google and click images, you'll come up with all of these different models that have been created by various researchers and writers and authors who are interested in the hero's journey, and they have their own slight variations on it. And it often begins with this idea of the call to adventure. So the hero starts off in a mundane situation of normality from which some information is received that acts as a call to head off into the unknown. Then there's often sometimes a refusal of a call. So when the call is given, the future hero refuses to heed it. This may be from a sense of duty or obligation, fear, insecurity, sense of inadequacy, etc. And we're not going to go into all of the details of this, but you can see that the hero's journey often begins with a separation. In this case, it goes around counterclockwise. Begins with a bit of a separation from the rest of the community, the family, etc. And then there is this kind of rite of passage, this initiation, if you will, only to result in a return to the group, the family, the community, and with great gifts, great wisdom, etc. So that's one version right there of what Joseph Campbell calls the monomyth, here's another version. This one goes in clockwise order, and begins with, and again, different writers are going to come up with different terms for the various steps along the way. In this case, it's the ordinary world, and then the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, etc., etc. So, and you'll recognize some of this if you think about some of the great movies. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. There is this time when things are fairly normal, and then this call to adventure, and then off they go, etc. And so, what is the problem with that? Why is this a problem? Here's one final look at a model, again similar to the other one, you can see that people have gone to some lengths to put some great graphic design around this, and we've got this third model. So what's the problem with this? Why is this an issue? Well, it has to do with some of the elephants of the journey, and the hero's journey is could also be called the manomyth, because it is and has traditionally been thought of as male-oriented. It's a solo journey of a solo male. Traditionally and historically, and that's the problem is in our evolution towards a more collaborative workplace, a more collaborative world where we have to figure out how to work together better. There is still this idea of the solo journey. In the idea and the notion of a hero and the hero's journey, and that one we have to address and talk about. No, it's not about one person. It's about togetherness. It's about what we can do together. It's about the collaborative. So then the next idea, the next element that comes out of the hero's journey, the idea of the chosen one, is also problematic. Here we've got this this notion that one is chosen by some deity, by some group, voted in, etc., as chosen for this journey. And again, it's we would prefer not to feel that you're chosen, but rather that you choose yourself. And in fact, it's an element of the 6 seconds model of emotional intelligence to choose yourself, to step up, to take initiative, to step forward as being the one. So we like the notion of choose yourself versus being chosen by someone else. Then there's this idea of crossing the threshold, and quite often on these journeys, even some video games actually pattern their that journey off of the hero's journey. So at some point, there's this idea of crossing the threshold, going from one world to another world. Again, it's somehow problematic, this idea that you can never return or return the same. Some of it may be true, and certainly there's some interesting elements of the hero's journey that we don't want to just sort of ignore the whole thing. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to talk about how it has influenced our thinking and how some of our thinking is problematic. There's also this idea of seizing the force. And what's problematic about seizing the force is that it implies that we should be after more power and control, when in reality, in the new collaborative workplace, that's all about empowering others. And we really want to equate that type and that style of leadership with empowering others, not acquiring more power. So it's not about seizing the force, it's about giving the force away. And then finally, this idea that someone is going to return with a silver bullet, a panacea, a cure-all, a magic elixir. Again, it's a nice idea. Wouldn't we all like to find that? Wouldn't we all like someone to come into our organization, come into our community, come into our city, come into our country, and have the answers for us all? Well, it's just not realistic. It's much better that we work together to find solutions and component parts of solutions that are going to address the issues that we face, rather than one sort of magic bullet. Okay, so what's the relationship with emotional intelligence, and why are we talking about the hero's journey and emotional intelligence? Well, here's the model that we use, as many of you know, and this model was originally created by Dr. Reuven Bar-On, beginning in 1981, and it was published by MHS Assessments in 1997 as the first scientifically validated measure of emotional intelligence. And it consists of 15 competencies, which are a comprehensive way to understand human behavior and extremely helpful at both assessing leadership effectiveness and then helping leaders to become more effective by helping them to find ways to leverage strengths and address weaker areas. And many organizations worldwide are using this model and incorporating this model and basing their leadership development programs on this model because of its power. So companies like Google, Microsoft, Nike, Amazon, Philips Electronics, Allstate Insurance, just to name a few off the top of my head, are incorporating this model into their leadership development because it so informs what happens in the staff room, in the one-to-one interactions, in the hallway, when someone is all alone and no one is around, how to understand their motivation, their inspiration, their passion, their roadblocks, etc. So this is the model that we use. So we're going to take a look at some of the ways that that this model informs our thinking around this idea of heroic leadership. So what are some potential EQ advantages of a heroic leader? Well, what we know from our experience of 20 years and working with leaders at all levels within organizations is that heroic leaders, those who tend to take a more traditional approach to leadership, tend to have high self-regard. They view themselves very well. And this is good until it's not. And of course, you probably can think of what the potential downside is of a high self-regard that's not properly balanced off by other EQ competencies. Then there's this notion of being assertive, being able to speak up, ask for what you need and want, state your opinion, etc. And again, we find that traditional heroic leaders do this very well. They don't have any problems with assertiveness. Now, again, what we know is that an overused strength can become a weakness, and we want to guard against that and make sure that doesn't happen. So while these are some very good qualities, they have this potential downside. And of course, the potential downside of a high self-regard is being seen as arrogant. And the potential downside of high score and assertiveness, if it's not properly balanced off by other EQ competencies, is aggression. And then we've got independence. Many sort of traditional heroic leaders are independent, whereas what we want them to be is interdependent, but a high score in independence can also, if not properly balanced off by other competencies, come across as someone who is aloof, someone who is a maverick or a Mustang off doing their own thing, a lone wolf. Then there's problem solving, and many of our traditional heroic leaders are quite good at problem solving. And in fact, they would say that they don't get stuck, they don't feel overwhelmed, they don't procrastinate, which are all the ways that emotions get in the way of and bog down problem solving. So they're able to work through that. But again, in the absence of acknowledgement of emotions, one could have a high score in problem solving and not be in touch and in tune. Again, we want to look to other EQ competencies and make sure that we have a proper balance that leads to effectiveness. And then finally, stress tolerance. Quite frequently, heroic leaders are able to tolerate great stress, and they are the kind of people that you want to call upon in some sort of an emergency or a difficult situation. And again, the problem with a high score in stress tolerance, or at least a potential problem, is that someone is actually cut off from what's really going on and really able to experience the emotion that others are experiencing. So stress tolerance is a little bit like insulation that we have between us and our environment, and we want that insulation to be thick enough so that it doesn't take us out when things are difficult, challenging, uncomfortable, etc. But we want it to be thin enough that we still experience the world and we experience our environment and experience our situations. Okay, so those are some of the potential EQ advantages that heroic leaders have. Again, we want them to be possibly balanced off, and we want them to possibly serve those heroic leaders well. Now, potential EQ deficits of the notion of heroic leadership are things like emotional self-awareness. And now I chose Sylvester Stallone in Rambo because as the image here, because he's kind of the stereotypical extreme of masculinity. And this also fits with the notion of the hero's journey. Someone who is not very emotionally self-aware, not very emotionally expressive, doesn't really let on what's going on. They're kind of cold as ice. They're kind of a rock. And so what that does is it separates people from the people that they really want to be close with. And we see that with masculinity as well, that if you follow traditional notions of masculinity and believe that's what a man should be, your relationships will be of poor quality, unfortunately, because there will be little emotional self-awareness and emotional expression, because there's a belief that emotions are to be avoided and denied and ignored. And so that's unfortunate when that happens. So we have to understand that if we are to evolve, to collaborate and work together to save this world of ours, we've got to become adept at these skills and competencies. We have to know what's going on for us. We have to understand what's going on inside of us to guide and direct us, and tap into that wealth of knowledge that comes from emotional self-awareness. Then we have to express ourselves emotionally. We have to allow others to get to know us through our emotional expression. We don't trust what we don't know. And when people do not express themselves emotionally, verbally, and through their body language, and we really don't know what's going on with people, then we're forced to guess. And we're forced to make assumptions. And we all know what happens when we make assumptions. We could be wrong. And relationships suffer and are damaged. And this leads us to this idea of interpersonal relationships, which is where we intentionally emotionally express ourselves after we know what we're all about, in order to create stronger and deeper connections with others. And then there's this notion of empathy, where we're actually paying attention to and understanding that life is emotional, that work is emotional, that everything we do is emotional, and paying attention to others and how we're impacting on others is the skill of empathy. And knowing that when we make a decision, it probably will impact on people, and understanding that that we're having the impact that we're having, and that's done through empathy. And then there's social responsibility, this idea that we're actually all part of one great big giant cooperative game, where if we cooperate with each other, we can all get what we want and need. Versus the sort of competitive notion that where we compete with each other and I win and you lose, that's a terrible way to, it leads to the situation that we have now versus a more equitable and more compassionate world. So social responsibility is critical to address. And then finally, impulse control. That there is this idea that again, the heroic leader will, cross that threshold, will go on that journey, etc. And they don't necessarily control their impulses to think through things before they do them, which of course we really want to promote this idea that we exercise impulse control, that we may have our first emotions, we may have our first feelings, etc. And then we've got to consider how those are best expressed and what to best do with those in order to have the kind of effect that we want to and act with intention. Okay, so those are some of the potential EQ deficits of a heroic leader. Now, what does it have to do with leadership? Well, we thought of several different situations and circumstances where these are potential barriers to leadership. For example, the notion of founders syndrome, where you've got founders of companies who hang on to power and will not develop a leadership pipeline, will not assist other leaders in their leadership development. And what this leads to is decreased capacity building. This notion that for organizations to thrive, that founders recognize what they have to offer, and also are involved in capacity building throughout the company, making sure that the transition from their founding of the organization to those who will come from behind to take over the running of and the operation of the company. There has to be adequate capacity building, and so the founder comes to the realization that you know what, my wisdom, my knowledge, my experience is only good if I give it away to others in the organization. And we also see that in some cases with the traditional heroic leader, a lack of humility. And we need that. We need to see that leaders are open to learning, that leaders are prepared to admit when someone knows more about something than they do. That's a critical and important piece of leadership. Also, a traditional notion of heroic leadership can lead to a lack of transparency. And of course, if we want trust, if we want this more collaborative workplace, we've got to have transparency where people are not necessarily keeping information to themselves, but sharing it freely, because there's no reason to keep information and not share it with others. There's also this notion of power hoarding. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the collaborative workplace of the future is all about empowerment and sharing power, not power hoarding. But again, in the absence of skills to do otherwise, people often feel like they have to hang on to that power. And we see this in various adversarial relationships between various groups in the corporate world, where people are hoarding power, and so one group may ultimately win on some level, and another group may ultimately lose on another, but in general, both groups lose. And finally, we see one-way communication. We tend towards the hierarchy in heroic or traditional approaches to leadership, and we need to change up the hierarchy. We need to have two-way dialogue and encourage dialogue for effective collaboration to happen. And finally, we see a lot of self-interest. And again, not to say that Joseph Campbell's notion or any other notion of heroes and leaders necessarily leads to these things, but it does influence our thinking. And so we sometimes think that this is the way to go. And particularly from these people, they think they're doing the right thing. They think they're doing what they believe to be right and true, and we're coming along and taking a more critical view and using our critical thinking skills and saying, wait a minute, perhaps some of these things are not the best way to go, and perhaps we're evolving and changing, and perhaps we can learn new skills, and we can change some of these things so that they're not so damaging to our organizations, to our employee engagement, to our productivity, to our morale, etc. What are the potential solutions? Well, what I did was took some of the areas that are potentially dangerous for the traditional heroic leader, and just made us a small suggestion. So, for example, if we've got these leaders who have high self-regard, make sure that that's coupled with humility, and talk about the importance of humility, and how, yes, we want you to acknowledge what you do well. We want you to acknowledge what's good about you, and we want you to feel good about yourself. We want you to feel confident and competent to do what it is that you do. But we also want you to do that with humility and recognize and understand that you are one of however many billion people there are on the world, 7 billion people on the world, and we're all in this journey together. No one's better than anyone else. We're all who we are, and we're walking along this journey of life together. So humility becomes critical and important for leaders to be relatable, for leaders to build relationships with their employees, for leaders to be seen as human and trustworthy. leaders need to exercise and use empathy. And traditionally, this was not done. Traditionally, this in the rigid hierarchy, in the power and control model, in the dominance model of leadership, empathy was not there. And so this led to a lowering and a decrease, and it does wherever it rears its ugly head. The hierarchy, dominance, power and control result in a lack of employee engagement, low morale, high stress, and quite often a retention issue, with the exception of those places that pay so much money that people are willing to put up with a lot of crap just to get the paycheck. But if we employ some empathy, we can address the emotional aspect of work. And of course, that's everything. It leads to employee engagement, to productivity, to organizational effectiveness. And so for a leader, empathy is a powerful, powerful competency that must be developed in order to be an effective leader in the 21st century. Then there's emotional self-awareness and emotional expression. If you go about your job thinking that your job is nothing but technical, you're sadly mistaken, for one thing, because we have all kinds of neuroscience research to demonstrate otherwise, that it really is about tapping into and understanding that the various activities and the various people that we're involved with create emotions in us as a result. And it's about being aware of those emotions, knowing who sets us off, knowing what our hot buttons are, knowing what sorts of things cause us to react with emotions that are not productive for us. All of those things will become critically important and give us important information about our environment. And then finally, the expression of emotion, as I mentioned, leads to trust and great relationships. And interpersonal relationships is number 4. And I suggest that people really consider the relationships that they have in the workplace and the potential for deep, meaningful relationships with people that you spend every day with. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It is my firm belief that everyone worldwide wants relationships of purpose and meaning, and relationships that matter, whether they know it or not. And why not have those at work with the people that you spend each day with? And finally, social responsibility is what is going to save the world. It's when each one of us recognize that we have a responsibility to others. And when we look for ways that we can be part of the solution in every situation, that's real leadership, and that's social responsibility. And so it is about giving to others. Stephen Covey's The Eighth Habit. He says that you can go from effectiveness, which is great, which is good. Effectiveness is good, but he says you can go to greatness when you use that what you've learned in the 7 habits for the greater good, for social responsibility. And that's the 8th habit. So social responsibility is critical and important. It's not a nice to do, a nice to have, it's critical. All right, so those are some potential solutions. So just to sum up, leadership has been influenced. Our notions of leadership have been influenced by the idea of the hero. Again, a critique of the maleness of it throughout history. Again, history is also told from a male perspective historically, and of course is changing as we become more inclusive in our academic institutions, etc. So we've got to recognize and understand those biases that we have and how we are influenced by those notions, and then we have to work to change them. So the potential to idealize the singular effort and again, power and control, which contradicts the need for collaboration and empowerment, is dangerous, and we see this in everyone from the dictators of the corrupt dictators of countries throughout the world, and in individual despots who rule with an iron fist in their companies, and it has tragic impact on others, and so we have to recognize and understand that some of that comes from our notion of the individual hero who's going to come up with the solutions for all of us, and it's just not that way, and it doesn't have to be that way in the 21st century, which is all about collaboration and empowerment. So ultimately, we need to look to EQ competencies to pave the way to better relationships characterized by trust, loyalty, commitment, clear communication. And when we have workplaces that are characterized by trust, loyalty, commitment, and clear communication, we see increases in retention, we see increases in engagement, we see increases in workplace culture and productivity, etc. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. And now it's time for a Q&A time. So please type your questions into the Q&A box or the chat box. Either one is fine, and we'll take a look at what you've got for me. I'd be very pleased and happy to answer any questions that you might have. So some of the questions that frequently come up around this are things like, how do I convince my boss that we need to perhaps challenge some of our notions of what leadership is, and really, that the evidence for such a transition is all around us, and it seems to be in what's happening in society, what's going on with workplace research, and simply sharing that information with that person. That look at best employers, look at leading workplaces, look at what they're doing in the workplace, with the employers that have the most resources available. What are they choosing to do with their resources? And we look to that and see that in actuality they are moving away from the notion of a heroic leader and moving towards the notion of being a great team player. And they're developing skills of collaboration, and they're using tools like the EQI, the Emotional Quotient Inventory, in their leadership development programs versus other assessment tools which don't necessarily look at how competent or not competent one is in the foundational skills of collaborative, participative leadership. So we really need to understand what we're working towards, and what we're working towards is a world where we share with each other, where we're transparent, where we have compassion and caring for each other. And this is the kind of leadership that the younger generations are looking for. And if they don't see it, they will demand it. And if they don't get it, they'll go elsewhere. They'll go to organizations that have figured this out. They'll go to organizations that have moved away from this notion of the hero leader and more towards the collaborative leader, the kind of person who brings people together in a larger collaborative than pushes people away. All right, so thanks so much for joining me today. We really appreciate it, and we're happy that you're here. We're going to at this time we're going to just give you a minute or two to see if there are any further questions from anyone. Yeah, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box, and let me know if you have any questions for me at this time. And if not, then we'll simply sign off. Okay, so all right, so let me just quickly review our final slide here, and then we'll bid you a wonderful day. So thanks for being here. Check out our website for our 20th anniversary limited time special offers. We've got the upcoming certification courses in all the major cities across Canada. I just came back from working with a major US city where we did a custom in-house certification course for their HR people, which was a great experience for me. And then check out our Leading with Emotional Intelligence course, which provides you with opportunities to offer in-house courses to your staff. We've also got a Heart and Science of Leadership for Women going on right now in Calgary, Alberta. Next course will be Vancouver and then Toronto and across Canada. We've got this our Writing for Emotional Intelligence course, this wonderful online course. So consider any of our courses or programs, and if there's anything that you'd like to talk about in terms of incorporating emotional intelligence into your organization, please let me know. And I'd be happy to have that conversation conversation with you. You can always reach me at david@eitrainingcompany.com, and finally our website, which is simply eitrainingcompany.com. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and do check out our website for future free webinars, and we're very happy to oblige if you've got ideas for future webinar topics. Thanks everyone. Bye for now.